preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Well, thank you very much for being here. It's certainly a pleasure for me to be at a place where they have such short podium. I have spent too many evenings of my life standing on tiptoe, straining to see whoever was in the front row, so it's very nice not to have to do that tonight. I thought that I might begin tonight by being personal and relating what I have to say tonight to my personal experience, because it certainly does grow out of that. As the introduction mentioned, I became chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities in 1986. And it was a job that I took on with great enthusiasm, partly because I had found my own life so enriched by the study of subjects like literature and history and philosophy. And I spoke during my Senate confirmation hearings about the ways in which these subjects had enriched my life. I talked about the ways that history gives us models of excellence that inspire us and urge us on to greater effort. I talked about the enduring truths that one can find in literature. And I spent a great deal of time in those confirmation hearings talking about an author, the man about whom I had written my dissertation, Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold, the essayist I talked about in my confirmation hearings, who had this notion that we would ennoble ourselves by studying the very best that had ever been thought and written, is one way that he liked to express it. He had this notion that humanistic study was an effort to learn and propagate the best that has been known and thought in the world. He had this notion that it was a disinterested endeavor, that we would try to be objective, to get outside ourselves when we studied great history and great literature. And he had this idea that it could give us a sense of the best, a sense of excellence. He had this idea that it would give us standards by which to judge our own efforts, standards to motivate us to ever and ever greater effort. And in one of his most wonderful essays, one called The Study of Poetry, he talks about how it is you can use the standards of literature to measure yourself and your efforts. He talked about touchstones, the most excellent passages of poetry that had ever been written, touchstones against which you could measure other things that you might read to see if they began to measure up. And some of his touchstones were from Homer, and some were from Dante, and some were from Shakespeare. One is Hamlet's dying request to Horatio, the wonderful lines in which Hamlet says, "If thou didst ever hold me in thy heart, absent thee from felicity a while, and in this harsh world draw thy breath in pain to tell my story." They are such wonderful lines, and Arnold thought that by acquainting ourselves and holding in our minds such wonderful lines, we would have a standard by which to measure other things we read, and a standard indeed by which to measure ourselves. And these were the reasons I loved the humanities, and these were the things I talked about in my Senate confirmation hearings. But it didn't take me very long at the National Endowment for the Humanities to understand that history and literature, as I understood them, were very different from history and literature as they were understood in the academic world today. That the notions I had about trying to be objective, trying to seek the truth, the notions I had about excellence were regarded as silly illusions some of the time, dangerous delusions at other times. The idea was that there was no such thing as truth, and I encountered this again and again. No thing out there that we should be trying to seek in scholarship or in teaching. That all those things we thought were true were merely constructs, creations that the dominant class, read white males, had visited on the rest of us. Well, I found this way of thinking so amazing that I spoke out about it. I suppose I had, I don't mean to portray myself as having undertaken an especially brave act because I was not from the academy. I had no intention of going back to the academy. And so I was quite free to speak out about what I saw happening. And it caused the most amazing reaction. When I began to suggest that maybe truth was something that should be valued, when I began to suggest that objectivity was something that was important, it caused the most hostile and violent reaction. Not a debate, not a reasoned discussion of whether my view was somehow lacking, or perhaps whether someone else's view was, but a violent discussion, a violent reaction that usually entailed name calling of one kind or another, invective. There was this wonderful morning when I woke up and read in the New York Times that I had been thoroughly denounced, booed, and hissed at an academic conference in North Carolina. It's so bizarre if you think about it. All these professors becoming involved in this kind of activity. One professor had stood on the stage and held up a pamphlet in which I had talked about the importance of truth. And was urged on by the audience to greater and greater exaggerations about the faults in my character. But if you think about it, I mean, it was so amazing a reaction. I just still laugh when I think about it. But if you consider the philosophical basis here for what was happening, it really makes a lot of sense. If you don't think there's any such thing as truth, then reasoned discussion isn't important at all. Because there's nothing you're going to advance toward through reasoned discussion. In fact, if you don't believe in such a thing as truth, reason doesn't exist either. There's no reality out there by which you can measure one step of reason against another, no reality out there from which you can pull evidence, verification, and facts to support your point of view. So if you don't believe in truth, invective and name-calling makes sense in a way. The way to get people to support your point of view is through intimidation. You just yell at them and you call them names until they finally get so tired they go home. Or maybe they just say, oh, okay, I'll go along with that. So it's a very logical, in a way, response to a world that's been deprived of logic and reason and the idea of truth. This situation, as I explained in my book, and this is my book, I'm still so happy with the way Simon & Schuster made it look. I'm happy to hold it up for you. I explain in my book that this situation caused a great deal of difficulty at the endowment. Once you have a scholarly world in which a great number of people say that there's no such thing as truth, and that scholarship is not about the pursuit of truth, but it's about advancing politically useful viewpoints, which is what comes into the vacuum, then what do you do with an organization that's been founded on the other idea? The endowment was founded on the notion that scholars pursue the truth, that they build theses, that they then support these theses by evidence, that they proceed in this rather old-fashioned way. What do you do in this new and postmodern world when no one believes in all those older values anymore? And you have a great deal of trouble is what happens. And I recount in my book some of the instances in which I faced those difficulties. But more important, and I've realized this ever more since I left the endowment and became part of the larger society, spending my time in private life, more and more I realize that isn't the real problem. The academic results of this academic way of thinking aren't nearly so important as the results that this way of thinking is now having on the larger culture. The idea of there being no truth has been profoundly destructive in the modern academy. But even worse, it is now destructive throughout the culture. It is now destructive in one profession after another profession after another profession. To talk for a minute about something that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, you can see the results in art. You don't have to look at academic art historians to see the result. You can go to a Whitney biennial and see the results. When you don't believe that there's such a thing as truth, when there's not a reality out there against which you're going to measure the claims you make to see if they're true, When you don't believe in that, when the external reality has gone away, then there are no standards either. Standards disappear as well. There's nothing out there to measure ourselves against. They're only the things that you and I make up. And the typical interpretation is there are only the things that the dominant group has made up and told the rest of us constitutes beauty. In other words, all of those things that we think are beautiful, that form the organization and the composition and the essence of beauty, all of those things are just constructs that the dominant culture has imposed on the rest of us. And the reaction to this is the Whitney Biennial, the 1993 Biennial in particular, where you had artist after artist deliberately rejecting all of those standards of traditional beauty. And I suppose the highlight and the most, the epitome of this rejection was seen in a work of art, though that's not what I should call it, in a work by Sue Williams. It was a mixed media puddle of vomit on the floor with a guard strategically positioned so that no one had to step in it. It was a statement about women, a statement about bulimia, perhaps an important statement to make. But what an odd thing that it should be in a museum of art. It was also an effort to fly in the face of, to demean any notions we might have had about standards of beauty. And this occurred again and again in the 93 Biennial, to some degree in the more recent one as well. So you see it in the art world, this notion that there's no truth out there, no reality, no possibility of standards to measure ourselves against. I think one of the most fascinating and yet somehow troubling, perhaps the most troubling place we see it is in psychotherapy, where you now have therapists saying it doesn't matter whether what the patient says is objectively true or not. It only matters if it makes the patient feel better. And this, of course, is a central part of the recovered memory phenomenon. And there's story after story of families destroyed, of human lives destroyed, really. People being put in jail, actually. Because psychotherapists encourage people to come up with ideas that they think will make them feel better. And it doesn't matter if the ideas have any objective reality or not. The talk about there being no possibility of objectivity, no objective standards out there that we can measure our work against, occurs in journalism. It's been fascinating to me to see journalists take up this postmodern conversation. Journalists for the Washington Post, right after the 1992 election, wrote about how journalists had wised up and now understood that objectivity was a delusion. Max Franco, writing in the New York Times not too long ago, wrote about the fact that one could only get at the truth by being subjective. The media critic for Wired magazine, a young man named John Katz, just 2 months ago, I think it was, declared objectivity to be an immoral cult in Wired magazine. So it's the same idea. You know, we can never get out there, never see what's out there, never find a thing out there to measure ourselves against. It's all internal. It's all your idea and my idea, but there's no common ground out there that we can all seek. I have a chapter in my book on law and how this has affected law. And I suppose you all know that the jury is coming in tomorrow with a verdict, the O.J. Simpson trial. Yeah, 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. It's a cause for concern. Some people say, of course, that the longer the jury is out, the worse that is for the defense. I somehow think this verdict is coming in so quickly that I suspect that Johnny Cochran's probably feeling pretty good tonight. And Johnny Cochran, in fact, was one of those people who was doing in the law what we saw happening in art, what we saw happening in psychotherapy. What he told the jury, in essence, is the facts of this case don't matter. What matters is whether you are going to do the right thing about racism in the Los Angeles Police Department. So the verdict that we used to think was about truth and falsity was, so the jury was told, not about that. It's about whether there was racism in the Los Angeles Police Department. He was talking in terms of a double standard that I point out exists in other parts of the law in my book. There's now a thesis that's held by some people who work in racial theory. Mari Matsuda at Georgetown University is the main advocate of this idea, that we have to have two standards of free speech, for example. There's one standard of free speech for anybody who's a member of the dominant group, i.e. white males. And they should have speech codes imposed upon them, speech codes that keep them from saying anything negative about members of the non-dominant group, i.e. women and minorities. On the other hand, people who are in those non-dominant groups should have no speech codes. They can say anything they want about everyone else in the society. It's encouraging a double standard, you see, that assumes that there is no one standard out there against which we should all be measured. There's no truth out there. There are only truths for different groups. It is a very pernicious way of thinking. I thought I would spend the most time tonight, though, talking about the area that I personally have spent the most time on, and that's how this affects our schools. This notion that there's no truth out there, no reality out there that we should go out and find as best we can. We're never going to get there. You know, we're fallible and we're not omniscient. And anytime we think we have the truth, we should hold it pretty tentatively in our hands, because tomorrow we might find out something more, and tomorrow we might have a deeper understanding. We should keep trying to get closer and closer to it. We shouldn't think that we can just say and teach anything because it will advance a cause that we like. And yet we are beginning to do that in our schools. We are teaching our children that this is a pretty sad place, this country, to have been born in. We're teaching our children that the story of the United States is a pretty grim and gloomy one. And we should teach them that we have many faults, and we should teach them that we have many failings. But we're forgetting to teach them the good parts. We're not teaching them the heroes. We're not teaching them the heroines that we used to. We're not teaching them about our accomplishments. We're not teaching them about our triumphs. We're focusing on our tragedies. We're focusing on our faults. We're focusing on our flaws. President Clinton said a few nights ago that he thought the nation was in a funk. I sometimes read the history that we're teaching our children, and I say it's no wonder that they would be in one. The picture we're giving them is so grim. I have a passage in my book about the various encounters I've had with teaching Columbus over the last couple of years. One episode of Columbus bashing I came across occurred in New Jersey, where a teacher wrote an entire article about how we should not teach him as a hero. And I don't mean that we should teach him as an unadorned hero, because of course we shouldn't. He had faults and failings, and some of them were horrible. But think what he did. I mean, it's just an amazing thing to think of setting out in those little boats and going across a vast ocean. And maybe he didn't really understand what he discovered, but what kind of spirit motivated him? That's something we're teaching our kids about, even as we teach them about his perfectly dreadful, horrible, cruel attitude and actions toward Native Americans. But this teacher in New Jersey was describing how you might have, and in fact how she manages to teach her kids that he was a greedy person and a murderer, and that he stole America. And she came up with the following suggestion. What you do is you tell your kids every day this story. You tell them, imagine that the principal of this school wants you to think that Columbus is a hero, and he teaches you every day that Columbus is a hero. And at the same time he's doing that, he's going out every month or so to neighboring schools and capturing students, enslaving them, and stealing their books and stealing paper and bringing it all back to his school and enriching himself. Well, she said, this is how you teach them that the reason their country, their government would like them to believe that Columbus had something heroic about him. The reason they want the students to believe that is so they can do the same to the rest of the world. In other words, anybody who tries to say there was anything heroic about Columbus's journey is essentially justifying American imperialism in the 20th century. There was a teacher in California at a multicultural conference who was asked, well, what do you do with those students who want to teach, that Columbus was the flowering of the age of exploration, and he wasn't a man that we should worship as a hero in any way. He was very flawed. He did many things that were bad. But what do you do with those students who want to say, yes, but he was the flowering of that age that would set off across the ocean in those tiny, tiny ships? And she said, what you do is you tell them to study Columbus because he wanted to explore and he had a vision. That would be, and these are the teacher's words, like a Jew studying Hitler because he had a dream. Isn't that amazing? I ran into a North Carolina student who had a spelling test that she took near Columbus Day. She had to learn to spell words like Holocaust and genocide. It is truly amazing what we're doing. We should teach the flaws, but we're not teaching the accomplishments. We shouldn't retreat into the old myths. Nobody would want that for a minute. In many ways, we should be very proud of the history books we have in our schools now, because they don't teach those old myths. They bring in the bad. They often don't emphasize the good enough, and many teachers go much further, as these teachers have, and emphasize the bad almost exclusively. But we brought in other stories, too. When I went to school, we didn't learn about what women had done in history. And I think my children and your children are much luckier because they do now. We didn't learn about what Asian Americans had contributed or African Americans, and our children do now, and we should be proud of that. But we should also teach them the old heroes. And we should also teach them the story of the United States as a time in which, as a story in which human freedom has progressed, because it has progressed and become greater for every generation. I spend time in my book talking about the national history standards, which I always confess up front I had some role in bringing into being. There was a movement at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, a completely bipartisan movement that advanced the idea that we should have standards for our schools. And if you think about it, this is a truism. Of course we should have standards for our schools. We should have some rational notions of what students should know and what they should be able to do at certain stages in their education. And we should have high standards for our students, and we should expect a lot of them. And not having standards gets us into a situation where parents think their students are doing okay, when in fact, compared to students in other parts of the world, they're not doing very well at all. So of course it seems like a good idea to have standards by which we can measure students' progress and see how they're doing in comparison with students in Japan, say, or in France, or in Germany. What happened, however, is that the standards that were finally developed some 2 years after I left the endowment and some several years after the standards movement started, in at least 2 subjects, and one could argue that this is true in more subjects than that, the standards that were developed were very bizarre. They did not reflect the idea that we should try to arrive at the truth of American history and tell it as accurately as possible and tell it in ways that we can bring as much evidence as possible to bear upon. Instead, they do reflect that agenda I was talking about before, wherein we make the story of the United States, and indeed of European and Western civilization, seem as grim and as awful as possible. In the standards that were set forth for United States history, for example, George Washington is sort of a passing figure. I think he's mentioned 3 times, but never as our first president. He sort of appears on the scene and disappears again. While Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism appear 19 times, the Ku Klux Klan appears 17 times, the Great Depression 25 times. You get the picture. I mean, this is a story of America that would make you wonder why you would be proud to be an American. There's no Alexander Graham Bell, no Wright brothers, no Edison, no Einstein, no Jonas Salk, no Neil Armstrong in the standards. The great heroes of scientific and technological achievement are entirely missing. I've been working on a second book as well as finishing this one. And the other book I'm writing is what I'm doing with my husband. We're really rewriting, bringing up to date a book that we did earlier about leadership in the House of Representatives. So I've been doing some research on a current Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. And whatever you might think about the Speaker's politics, and I know he's controversial, but he's doing some very interesting things. But whatever you might think about his politics, I've been watching the tapes that he made, history for the most part. It's called Renewing American Civilization. I'll bet there's not one of you who wouldn't like the history, because it's the history that we used to learn. It's the history that we used to be inspired by. It is a history that is a complete corrective to the kind of thing that's going on college campuses and in our schools. Now, what reminded me of it is Edison. The speaker talks about Thomas Edison. He doesn't completely neglect him as the national history standards do. And he talks about him not only as the father of invention, but the father of persistence, you might say. And he tells the story of Edison trying to invent the storage battery. And he tried 9,000 experiments, and not one of them worked. And his staff was getting very discouraged. And he said, "You don't understand. Those are not 9,000 failures. Those are 9,000 positive achievements that we understand don't work." And he tried 41,000 more experiments, 50,000 experiments, before he finally came up with something that has transformed transformed our technology. Well, this is a story we should tell our kids. Instead of neglecting Edison entirely, this is a wonderful story. It doesn't matter where a little child would come from, whether it's a boy or a girl or whatever his or her racial or ethnic background. This is a wonderful story. This is not the story we're telling now. In the world history section of the history standards, clear back to the beginning of time, and you talk about how men and women had different roles, and it's regarded as gender differentiation until you get to ancient Greece. Suddenly in ancient Greece, once you've entered the birthplace of Western civilization, suddenly it becomes oppression of women, the fact that men and women play different roles. Now, I'm not saying I want to be a woman in ancient Athens. I'm just saying we should treat history that is in our own heritage the same way that we treat history in other heritages. If any of you have kids and you're interested in looking at their textbooks, I will tell you the acid test to figure out whether your kid's textbook is accurate or whether it holds your civilization and their civilization to a different standard than it holds other cultures and civilizations. Look up the Aztecs. Are the Aztecs presented as people who had wonderful architecture, great irrigation systems, a society that was very pleasant to live in for many people? Are they presented entirely that way, or is it also mentioned that they practiced human sacrifice in a most extensive fashion? That, according to some accounts, in a good weekend, 10,000 people would die. If the second half isn't mentioned, you've got one of those history books that is just certain sure to tell every fault and failing of the American story and of Western civilization and underline it 7 times, put exclamation marks after it, but it won't take the same critical look at other cultures and civilizations. And of course, the history standards do not do that. The fact that the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice isn't mentioned. Something that has made many people very upset about the history standards is the treatment of the Cold War, which is made to seem as though it wouldn't matter how it had come out. The Cold War is portrayed as the interplay of 2 big superpowers. The Korean War is seen as the interplay of these 2 superpowers rather than as an example ever of anything that a totalitarian government might have done wrong. This has this treatment of the Cold War, and it's important, I think, that I say this here now, but let me say it again before I end this presentation too. This is not a conservative interpretation of the history standards. The idea of what is wrong with the history standards in terms of the Cold War in particular has upset people across the political spectrum. Al Shanker has written about it very articulately. I know that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. has been troubled about the treatment in the Cold War. He has a line that he uses. He says, "There's too much Joe McCarthy in the standards and not enough Joe Stalin," which I think is a pretty accurate take on what is going on here. So we're not telling our kids the truth. I don't want to give them an unvarnished, I don't want to give them a picture of American society that's not true, but we're trying now to give them one that's not true. Let us try to work together and get at some common ground. That is not the only thing we're doing in our schools. It's not just history that is a problem. I was assigned by my host tonight to talk about standards, and I've talked about one kind. One of the things that's happened with standards in our schools is that the whole notion of standards itself, that whole notion has been under attack. It's seen as oppressive, and it's largely feminists who advance this viewpoint. And I hate to say it that way, because in the early days of the feminist movement, I certainly thought of myself as a feminist. In the early days when the movement was about equality for women, I certainly was supportive of that effort. I was an academic in the days, a new academic in the days when an English professor who was hiring could still ask, as one did of me, Dr. Cheney, are you married or are you really interested in a job? Isn't that amazing? I mean, this was 1970, and within 4 or 5 years, because of the feminist movement, this question was no longer askable. As well, it shouldn't have been. There shouldn't have been one standard for women. He would never have asked this of a man, and another for men. So as I begin to say things that seem unsympathetic to feminism, please understand that it's not unsympathetic with what feminism was in the beginning, but with what it has become now, which is often irrational special pleading. And that is the case when you look at what is being said about girls in our schools. Time and again we're told that girls are victims. Time and again we're told that girls simply aren't treated as well by their teachers, they're not doing as well in the school system, they need special help, they need money. It's always money in the end that they need. And there's really not much of a case to be made for this. If you look at the statistics, if you look at the evidence, sure, girls don't do as well in math and science, but boys don't do as well in reading or writing. And girls are much less likely to be held back, and girls are much less likely to have to go into special education classes. And my favorite piece of evidence about how well girls are doing in our schools is from a study that's done every year of college freshmen. These would be young men and women who've just come through our school system for the most part. And it's a question that aims to get at how ambitious they are. And it used to be that, of course, it was the boys who were ambitious. And it was the boys who said, I'm going to be a doctor and I'm going to be a lawyer. And maybe 1 or 2 girls, but not too many. But listen to the 93 statistics. In 1993, 27.3% of the female freshmen said that they intended to go on to medicine, law, or to get a PhD, while only 25.8% of the boys did, of the male freshmen. I cannot tell you what a turnaround that is statistically. And it's growing. In 1994, it was 28% of the women intending to go on, and only 25.6% of the men. So girls are doing very, very well in our schools, but there's still been this effort to portray them as victims, and the political intent of that effort became very clear in 1993 and 1994 when legislation was introduced to put special funding into gender equity legislation, into gender equity causes. Millions of dollars of your money and mine. While the equity legislation did not go forward by itself, it was made part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, so that today in the Department of Education you have a person whose sole job is to worry about gender equity in our schools. And of course it's just to worry about gender equity for girls. It's not for boys. I don't have any boy children or any boy grandchildren yet. But if I did, I would be very concerned with this notion that somehow girls are the ones that need all the help, girls are the ones that need all the special treatment, and boys, who in fact need it as much, if not more, are being ignored. Feminism has been particularly unkind to the idea of standards, and this is, I think, a place where many women lost sympathy with the feminist community, because standards are defined as a special male way of approaching the world. Women do not approach the world in that way, or so goes the kind of orthodox thinking that has become a part of feminism in the late 20th century. There's a woman named Peggy McIntosh who's frequently quoted when these subjects come up. She talks about there being two kinds of thinking. One is lateral, and it's lateral thinking that she assigns to women. Lateral thinking, going across like this, has as its aim to establish a decent relationship with the universe, says Peggy McIntosh. Then there's vertical thinking, the kind that goes up and down, and this is the one that white males practice, and it's the one that she has said repeatedly makes them so dangerous. Excellence, you see, is a product of vertical thinking, because excellence implies that you're moving up a ladder, reaching for some top up here where excellence lies. And excellence is something that goes along too with the idea of standards. You know, if you reach the top of that ladder and you reach that thing called excellence, then you have matched the standard of excellence. But all of that, as Peggy McIntosh and many other feminists see it, is not a good way to approach education, not a good way to teach our children to think or to behave. For one thing, it makes some people feel bad, you see, because not everybody's going to get up there to the top. Secondly, that whole idea of being up there at the top is a male construct that just oppresses all of those people who don't feel so good about not being there. This hierarchy is regarded as something to be avoided at all costs, and it has, as one result, an amazing devaluation of the notion of grading. Instead of there being separate grades, A through F, now everybody gets A's and B's. And that's only a slight exaggeration. Here's one report. It used to be that high school teachers gave twice as many C's as A's. This was in 1966. 12 years later, the ratio had changed dramatically, with the number of A's given exceeding the number of C's. So instead of twice as many C's as A's, you now have more A's than C's. 12 years after that, in 1990, 20% of entering college students, 1 out of every 5 students, reported that they had had an A average for their entire career. So just think what has happened to the notion of distinctions between people. We can't make those. They are a product of vertical thinking instead of lateral thinking. According to a survey conducted by the Higher Research Institute at the University of California at Los Angeles, in the fall of 1994, 28% of college freshmen reported high school grade averages of A- or better. Isn't that amazing to think of how that's all been leveled out, that leveling that's happened? It's even worse, of course, at the college level. Getting a little off my topic now, but these are such amazing statistics. At Stanford, over 70% of undergraduates get A's and B's. At Princeton, the number is 80%. 80% get A's and B's. According to Harvard instructor William Cole, this is a quote, "The gentleman's C has been replaced by the gentle person's B, and A- is gaining ground fast, especially in the humanities." Cole goes on to explain this. He says, relativism is the key word today. There's no standard out there. It's all relative. Relativism is the key word today. There's a general conception in the literary academic world that holding things to high standards, like logic, argument, having an interesting thesis, is patriarchal, Eurocentric, and conservative. The effect of this leveling down, this notion that somehow it's wrong to make distinctions between people, doesn't just affect grades, it also affects competition generally in our schools. There was a front page story in the New York Times a few years ago about how gym classes have changed. Nobody plays dodgeball anymore because there are winners and losers. What you do instead in gym class is jump rope. Peggy McIntosh has declared that debate clubs are harmful because they put people into categories of winners and losers. A mother not long ago wrote to Ann Landers and complained that in her school there are no more spelling bees. Because you see, this would rank people. Some people would be good spellers and some people would be less good spellers, and the less good ones would feel bad. Indeed, it's not just that there are no more spelling bees, there's no more spelling in many schools. I've come across this wonderful phenomenon, in a very ironic sense I say that, called approximate spelling. And it exists in schools in Virginia, and it exists in schools in Arizona. I've come across examples there too. The notion is that Johnny and Jane will be completely inhibited if we force them to spell correctly. And so what you do is you just encourage them to write fast and to approximate their spelling. And they should just get it out and not worry about how the words are spelled. Well, Johnny's mother is the one who first called this to my attention. She lives in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And Johnny came home and he had spelled cook with 2 K's. So I guess that really makes kook, doesn't it? But he spelled cook with 2 K's, and his mother tried to correct it. And he said, no, you don't understand. The teacher says it doesn't matter. And in fact, when she checked into this, she found out not only did it not matter, but that Johnny actually was looked upon in a praiseworthy way. It was regarded as a good thing that he had spelling errors because it meant that he wasn't worrying too much about his spelling. He was doing what approximate spelling demanded. Well, any of you who've hired assistants lately, and I have one actually here with me tonight who's very good and she does know how to spell, but I have hired assistants with master's degrees who can't spell. And it's hardly a wonder, is it, when we don't emphasize this as something that is important. So no more spelling bees, no more spelling, no more honor rolls. There was an article not long ago in one of our major education journals saying that honor rolls highlight some of the least attractive aspects of our culture. In other words, the idea that some people would achieve and others might not achieve so well. But one of my favorite stories that brings home this syndrome is about a golden book that I read when I was a little child and that I read to my children, and that I'm going to be sure my granddaughter reads. A little golden book about Tootle the Train. You remember this story? Tootle's a very talented little train, but he has trouble concentrating. I suppose if Tootle were in our schools today, he would be sent right off to the counselor. He doesn't concentrate as well as he should, and when he's trying to get between one place and another, he gets off the tracks every once in a while, and he goes out and he plays in the meadow with the horses, and he has a pretty good time. And people keep telling Tootle he needs to concentrate, he needs to settle down, he needs to focus, because he has potential. And if he will just focus his attention, he can be the greatest train that ever went on the tracks between New York and Chicago, the greatest flyer ever. But he just doesn't do it. He just doesn't do it until finally one day the whole town gets together and in a plan really brings home to Tootle that he has this problem, that he needs to concentrate, he needs to focus, and he sees the light and he concentrates, he focuses, he works very hard, and sure enough, he becomes the most famous flyer that ever went on the tracks between New York and Chicago. Well, this story has now become a bête noire, something to be avoided, according to many educational theorists. Rita Kramer has written a wonderful book called Ed School Follies, in which she has gone to education schools around the country, and she recounts this scene in an educational classroom in which the teacher asks the students to explicate for her what exactly is wrong with Tootle the Train. Why is this story so pernicious? And as Rita Kramer reports that there are some older students in the class who say, well, I'm not sure there's anything wrong with this. I mean, isn't this what we want our kids to know? Work hard and you'll make it. But there's one bright young student, Amy, who's sort of the star of the class, and she hits the nail on the head. She gets exactly right what is wrong with the story of Tootle the Train. It's about meritocracy, says Amy. It's about some people make it and others don't, and if you don't make it, you say, what's wrong with me? So the story of Tootle the Train is no longer something that we're supposed to teach our children. I dedicated this book, in fact, to my granddaughter. She's now 16 months old, and she's only that old, so she insists on telling everyone that she's 2. And I dedicated this book to her partly because I wanted to hold up to the light some of the ideas and practices that I don't want to have impinging on her life. I want her to understand the greatness and the goodness of this country. I want her to know its flaws and its failings, but I also want her to know that this is a great and a good nation. And I want her to know that she is very, very lucky to be born here. I want her to know how many opportunities there are for her as a woman. I don't want her to think for 1 minute that she's a victim. I want her to get involved in every debate class she can and to understand how stimulating it is when you have the clash of ideas. And I want her to know, at least sometimes in her life, how nice it is to have worked hard and to be able to stand up and to distinguish yourself from the crowd. And getting back to those things that I talked about in the beginning, Matthew Arnold and those wonderful lines from Hamlet that he held up as a touchstone, I want her to know that kind of beauty. And I don't want her to think of it as a conspiracy that white males are trying to foist upon her. And I want her to read Shakespeare, and I want her to read not just Hamlet, but The Tempest, and to hold in her mind for a few minutes Prospero's lines, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on." And I want her to understand this is a commentary on the human condition, about how life is fleeting, and life is beautiful, and life is foolish, and life is beautiful. And not just understand The Tempest as a play about colonialism, which is how it's often taught now. Caliban is the new hero of The Tempest. And I don't care if she learns that, but I do care that she also learn the other part. I do care that she also learn about truths that have existed for a very long time, that transcend age and transcend circumstance, and that can enrich her life and make it better. And it is not, and let me emphasize this, I said I would emphasize it again before I'd finish speaking, it's not because I'm a conservative. I think that these are ideas that most people, whatever their politics are, want to pass on to the next generation. To make the point that telling the truth is not a book just for conservatives, I've headlined every chapter with a quote from George Orwell, who's so remarkably prescient in terms of understanding how our society has begun to go astray and get off the tracks. And George Orwell was not a conservative, not by any stretch of the imagination. I think a socialist would be the most accurate way to describe him. But you don't have to be a conservative, you don't have to be a socialist, you don't have to be any of those things to understand that whether we teach our kids what is true, whether we strive for accuracy, whether those things are important, I think is a notion that really goes across the political spectrum. And I conclude my book by talking about people who are standing up and trying to make a difference, trying to say that truth is important. It matters when you have a trial. It matters that you decide whether or not that person is guilty or innocent of what he's been charged with. A trial is not a situation in which you should make a statement about current politics. It matters if we teach our kids what kind of country it is. It matters if therapists and movie makers and museum curators, it matters if they present ideas as truly and as accurately as they can be presented. And some of the good news is that there are many people now beginning to do that. And I think most recently of the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian, where you had thousands of people writing letters saying, this exhibit, as you're going to present it, is not true. World War II was not an American war of retribution against the Japanese. That is not what World War II is about, and we don't want you to present it that way. And because so many thousands of people spoke out, the exhibit, in the end, sadly, was very much shortened, made very minimal, but that is better than telling something that isn't true. And thousands of people have written me about the history standards. I've been overwhelmed with mail. I had 5,000 letters in just a few months about the history standards because people want their children to know what is true. So I'm glad that all of you are here tonight. I'm glad that you care about this topic. And I would encourage you at any opportunity you find to emphasize this idea. It does matter whether we seek to tell the truth, whether we strive after truth. And I thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.